Welcome back to Non-Enough Projects. Today we are back on the 73 Dart that's behind me. Last time we got the rebuilt 360 engine and rebuilt 727 set back in the car. Today we're going to be working on the other half of the drivetrain equation, which is the rear end. So this car, like most factory slant 6 cars, came with a 7 1/4 rear end, which does not hold up very well to power. So when swapping a V8 into these cars, most people pull the 7 1/4 out and replace it with either an 8 1/4 or 8 3/4 out of an A body. And that's a super simple swap because it just bolts in because the car is an A body. Unfortunately, those rears have crept way up in cost in the recent years, so I wasn't even able to find one locally. That would be the way I would want to go, but even when you can find those rear ends, a lot of times they are stupid expensive for what they are. So a common swap is taking a Ford 8.8. This one is out of a late 90s Explorer. It already has the disc brake setup, and shortening the one side of the axle housing because you can see the center section is actually offset. One side, the passenger side, is longer than the driver's side by about a little over 2 inches. So you chop that tube, shorten it, and then it fits basically perfectly in an A body. Now, a lot of Mopar purists kind of get all up in arms about this, but this rear from the junkyard complete, it's a 373 limited slip differential with disc brake setup, was only like $200, so you really cannot beat this. You'd be spending thousands probably for a good 8 3/4 with a solid center section. So obviously the Explorer has a whole bunch of stuff that we're not going to need. We're going to have to relocate our spring perches, and we're not going to be using the sway bar mounts obviously, so let's start tearing this axle down. We're going to need to pop the cover so that we can get to the axle C-clips. We'll pull everything out of the housing except for the actual differential itself. We shouldn't need to touch that, hopefully. And then we're going to cut off the spring perches and sway bar mount. So I'm going to get to that. We're likely going to be reusing some of this brake line setup, so we'll try to save it as much as we can. So when we're shortening this, what we're doing is we're taking the longer side and we're making it the same length as the shorter side. So we're going to be using 2 short side axles. This is really a pretty common swap for these A bodies, so there's a lot of info about it. It's kind of intimidating cutting it and rewelding it, but you should be able to do it without too much trouble. Forgot to hit record. We got the sway bar removed and also the links that keep the rear positioned properly. We're going to pop the cover so that we can get the axle C-clips out and remove this axle. Here is the tag that tells us it's a 373 limited slip. You can see it's 3L73. There's also door tag codes that you can look up that tell you exactly what rear the vehicle has. You can also get 410 limited slips out of the Explorers pretty easily, so keep an eye out for that if you're looking for one of these also. Now this came out of a wrecked vehicle, which is usually what you want to do because it means everything was likely working okay. Rear ends aren't nearly as big of a wear item as like an engine or transmission, so usually you're okay. So you can see in here on the cover, very, very minimal sludge. And we look really good in here. We'll want to check for any chipped teeth or anything like that, but so far we're looking good. This ring here I believe is for the speed sensor. Now to get our axle retainer clips out, we first need to remove the separator bar. So there's a tiny little bolt there we got to remove. Looks like it's an 8mm. Probably a better idea to use a 1/4 inch to get a good angle. Now our bar will pop out. Then we'll push your axle in. And you can see the C-clip there. Looks like we're at 180 out. too fat. There we go. And now we'll remove our axle. Drip oil everywhere. And then the final thing we need to remove is just the backing plate, which has the park brake and the park brake shoes. Looks like these are 14 millimeter. And they've got a nut on the back side. Looks like the park brake cable's hanging us up, so we'll have to remove that. There we go. Well, I'll keep working on that, and then I'll tear the other side down the rest of the way, and we can get to cutting off our brackets. Alright, so a little bit smarter way to do this once you got the backing plate bolts out is you can leave the dust shield and brake shoes with the caliper bracket, so it just pops off like that. So that's way smarter. Alright, so now we're going to cut all of our bracketry off that we don't need anymore. I found the easiest way is with an angle grinder, obviously, but we'll just try to cut through as close to the tube as we can, but we're not going to try to get danger close. We'll come back with a grinder and grind it flat, but yeah. So I'll just keep working away on that. Alright, first one down. Now I'm going to do the rest of them now, but we'll come back and knock down the remainder of all the welds with a grinding disc at the end. Alright, I've got everything cut off of the axle tubes and got them cleaned up. I went over the whole thing with a flap wheel just to get it nice and clean. So now we're ready to actually measure and make our cut. So we need to cut 2 7/8 of an inch off of the long side, which is this side. We're going to want to cut inboard of where our spring perch is going to be, which is going to be about here, just because we don't want our spring perch on top of the weld. It's probably not too huge of a concern, but we'll cut just inside of there so that at the end of the day the weld will be around here and the spring perch will be right about here. Alright, so before we go ahead and mark for our cut, we need to create a clocking reference so that we get the flange clocked at the same position as it is now. So to do that, we're going to get a straight edge. I'm going to use this piece of angle iron, and we'll just draw across. Then we're going to find our approximate cut location. It'll be about here and here. And then we're just going to notch it lightly with the cutting disc so that we can line those two notches up after we take the cut out. Now we can actually create our reference for the cut. So I'm going to use a piece of masking tape so that we can use it as the tape as a reference to keep our cut square to the tube. So I actually went too far with the width of the tape. There's our first mark. Now I'm going to take calipers that are locked out at 2 7/8, which is the amount that we need to take out of this tube. You see I messed that mark up too. And then we're going to use that to figure out where we need to put the tape. So we want the inside of this tape to the inside of this tape to be exactly 2 7/8 inches, so that we know once we get the metal exactly to the edge of the tape, we've cut enough. Now we're going to double check our measurement, make sure we're 2 7/8 all the way around the tape. Which we're not, because one of them's not square to the other. See if we get off by 1/16 or so. Alright, so now we've got a solid 2 7/8 all the way across. So we're going to use these as our cut guides, and we're going to cut just inside of the tape. I'm probably going to cut a little bit away from the tape, and then we'll reach the final amount with a flap disc. Alright, so now we're ready to cut. So I'm going to start on this cut, because that's going to leave this section to cut, and it's going to be easier to cut off of the rest of the housing than having to hold this and cut nice and square. So like I said before, I'm just going to cut probably as close as I feel comfortable to the tape, but we're going to have to do the final pass with a flap disc. So we'll just try to keep square as best we can. It's not a huge deal because of the way we're going to weld the axle back up. Should keep it square. So if our cut goes a little bit off, it'll be corrected and there'll just be a little gap to fill. So, but as best we can, we're going to stay nice and square. I almost forgot. Before we cut all the way through the tube, I'm going to shove some rags down past where we're cutting just to keep any metal chips and whatnot out, because we still have this intersection in there. Okay, that should do it for us. There's a couple more in for good measure. Now we're good to cut. So there we go. See, we got a little bit to clean up, but not a ton. So now we'll just do the same over here. Alright, so now just on both ends, we're going to take the flap disc and just get to where we are to the tape. So this one's going to be easy by hand, that one's going to be a little bit more of a pain because it's still on the axle housing, but no big deal. Alright, so I've got our two pieces jigged up here just with 3 pieces of angle iron and chain clamps to keep everything square. So now we're going to measure. Our measurement from here to the outside face of this should be 17 3/8 all the way around. We're off by 3/32 of an inch, which is good actually, because if you undershoot it, that's obviously going to be a problem. So I'm going to take it off, flap disc the face of this until we have a perfect match with 17 3/8, and then we're going to bevel it so that we can weld. So I'm going to do the back and forth. Might take a few times. You measure all the way around, make sure everything's square, and I'm going to keep flap disking a little bit more away until we're at 17 3/8. Alright, so I got everything trimmed down. We're pretty much dead on, as close as we're going to get it. I also went ahead and beveled our joint. I also cleaned up the inside of the axle tubes super well, got any of the metal shavings out, along with any oil that could bubble up and ruin our weld. So we're looking good all the way around right now, so I'm going to tack it in a couple places. We'll take the angle iron off, we'll remeasure all the way around, and if we're still good, we'll go ahead and weld it solid. So I'm going to go ahead, get the welder fired up, and let's get to tacking. Alright, so I'll be welding this with gas MIG. You could do it with TIG, which I do have TIG, but MIG is going to be an easier weld for me on this one. So yeah, let's go ahead and tack it into the 3 spots that we can get to and see how we did with the fit up. Looks like I can't quite get to that third one I was wanting to get to. Let's measure now and see how we did before we pop the clamps off. Looking decent. There, fine. Tack in. Whoops, I think we accidentally welded the angle iron on. Alright, now we can check all the way around without the clamps getting in our way. If we're off even a little bit in any orientation, it's going to cook the bearings, or the single bearing, I guess. So, if we're off, we're going to have to cut the tacks and redo, so hopefully we're good. Now, obviously, a tape measure used like this is kind of crude, but we just need to be in the ballpark. I think a lot of guys complicate this a lot more than it needs to be. Obviously, the best way to do this is with a jig that goes and centers into the bearings in the center section and the bearing on the axle end of the housing. But those are like $600. So with this, as long as we're within, say, a 30-second, I think would be cool. Plenty of guys have done this way more redneck than this, so. Alright, we're dead on in every dimension. I'm super happy with that. So now we'll just go ahead, we're going to tack in the center of each. And once we're sufficiently sure that it's not going to walk around with the heat distortion, then we'll go ahead and we'll weld about an inch wide bead, alternating which side that we're putting heat into. Alright, now we're going to double, triple check, just because once we start welding beads, it's not a point of no return, but it's a point of huge annoyance if you got to cut all that back when we do it. Alright, we're still dead on, so now let's lay some beads. Alright, so after welding all the way around and knocking it back down with a flap disc to level, I filled in any pits that I missed, and now we're looking pretty good. Our measurements all still check out, so I think we can call that successfully shortened. Well, hopefully successfully shortened. So now I guess we're ready to test fit an axle. Alright, so I'm hooked on the outside of the other bolt, which is centered on the leaf spring. So if we measure to the inside of this bolt, we'll get the center to center measurement, and it is 43 inches. So we will set our new mounts there. Let's go look at the other axle. Alright, so what I got going on here is I've got two pieces of angle iron clamped to the outside of the axle housing flange, just so that I can measure from the inside of one to the inside of the other, and that'll give us the true outside to outside dimension of the rear end housing. The reason I had to use that is because otherwise you're going over this tall bump, and that's obviously going to affect your measurement. So that came out to, I believe it was 51 and a 16th, or 51 and an 1/8. So then I divided that by half, so that gives us the length from the center out to the outside of the flange. And then from that, we subtract 1/2 of the width of our spring perches center to center. So that's 43 divided by 2. This half measurement with 51/2 minus 43/2, that gives us 4 inches. Just a tiny bit over 4 inches, but again, not rocket science. So we're going to go 4 inches from the outside of this flange into the axle housing. That's going to be our center point for our spring perch. So before we actually set our perches on there, we need to figure out the angle for our rear end housing. So I'm going to take these off. So this is how the rear end is going to face in the car. This is obviously up. It's easy to tell because we have this boss for the ABS sensor and also the vent. Obviously that goes up. So the rear end, the transmission is 3.5 degrees down, so the rear end is going to be 3.5 degrees up. But since this is a car, the spring perches go on the bottom of the axle tube. So we're going to have to do this upside down. So we will flip this. So with this oriented upside down, we're going to need to go 3.5 degrees down. That way when we flip it, if you think about a line going like this, and we're measuring our angle against a parallel line to the ground, on this side this is 3.5 degrees up, on this side it's going to be 3.5 degrees down. So we're going to put our angle finder on here, I'm going to go down a little bit. So that's perfectly vertical. Alright, so there we go. We're just about 3.5 degrees down. Alright, so we've got both tubes marked at 4 inches from the outside of our flange. So that's going to be the center of our perches. Now, an easy way to make sure we're centered is we'll just take our width here, which is right about 2.5 inches. We're going to divide that by 2, and then we'll do 4 minus 2.5 over 2, which is going to give us 2.75. So we'll go 2 3/4 of an inch over. That should be this side of the perch. We'll test that. We'll center it by eye. And sure enough, we're right on our mark. So I'm going to do that on both sides, just so we know exactly where our perch is going to be. It's not super critical because the leaf springs have a lot of flex in them, but we'll get it as close as we can. So our pinion is still set at 3.5 degrees. So now we're going to put our angle finder on our perch, and we're going to set the perch at 90 degrees or 0 degrees, perpendicular to the ground. So there's dead on 0 degrees. Now we're ready to tack. I already went ahead and cleaned up both the axle tube all the way along where we're going to weld and the perch. I'm just going to tack them for now, and then we're going to test fit in the car just because I'm paranoid. Honestly, people probably make a bigger deal of pinion angle than is necessary, as long as you're not, you know, in the crazy extremes where like both are up or both are down or it's super mismatched. You're going to be fine. But we're going to get it as close as we can, and so we'll double check on the springs just to get it close. But we'll put tacks on this on both sides, and then we'll yank the 7 1/4 out and test fit this up and on. Alright, so we'll double check that we're perpendicular. We're on our marks, so let's give her a tack. Looking pretty decent. I'll just tack all 4 corners. Still straight up and down, we're on the marks. Good. Now we'll do the other side. There we go. Heat just bent us up a little bit there, but now we're good. Alright, good on both. So now as a sanity check, we'll flip it up to how it would actually sit in the car. We'll make the pinion perpendicular to the ground, and then we're going to measure our angle at the perches. And it should be 3.5 degrees up. Okay, that's dead on, 90 degrees. So I'll just put this down here. Alright, so we're 3.5 degrees this way. So if we zero this out, then that'll put the pinion 3.5 degrees up. So there's our reading, 3.5 degrees. What I was saying is if we were to turn the axle so that that's zeroed out, it would lift the pinion up 3.5 degrees. So that's perfect. I'll just double check the other one, and then we'll test fit in the car. Alright, obviously before we test fit, I gotta yank the old rear end out. That's not very interesting, so I'll bring you guys back once I got that done. Alright, I've got the 8.8 sitting in here. Obviously this is not the most scientific test because I realized I don't have the right chock plates, so we can't bolt down to the leaf springs, and also we're not putting weight on the axle. So at full ride height, the angle that we're measuring may change a little bit. We're a couple degrees off, 1 or 2 degrees pointed up more. That's due to the kind of hokey aftermarket spring shackles, which we may delete. They're 1 inch or 2 inches longer than the stock, which I believe is 3.5 inches. So we may end up swapping those out, or at least drilling holes at the stock ride height. I think we're just going to stick with how we have the spring perches tacked, and we'll just weld them solid where they're at. We'll double check at ride height once everything's together, and if we end up having issues, we can use a shim. And again, we're only 1 degree or 2 off, so it's really not a big deal. We can just leave it and be fine. So I'll yank this off, weld it solid, and then I guess get the axle housing prepped for paint. Alright, I got it all wire brushed and wiped down with lacquer thinner really well, so it should be good to paint. I'm going to use the self-etching primer because it's bare steel, obviously, and then I'll coat it with black. So bring you guys back once that's done, and then we're pretty much ready to get the entire rear end reassembled. Alright, got her all painted up. Looks pretty good, I think. Now I just need to reassemble the housing, put the brakes back on and everything. I think I'll just do that off camera. Nothing too exciting, just the opposite of what we did to take it apart. Probably getting a little long in the tooth, so I think we will call it here. Next time we're working on the Dart, obviously we need to put this into the car, and we also got a bunch of plumbing and stuff to do for the engine, but we're not far off, pretty close to first start, so looking forward to that. I will see you guys then.